Welcome to the Shipping Podcast, where you meet interesting maritime professionals sharing their passion for the shipping industry and their everyday job. I am your host. My name is Lena Gothberg. Welcome to the 6th episode of the Shipping Podcast. I'm so pleased that you want to listen to the maritime professionals and how they make a difference in their everyday job. Today, I'll introduce you to someone I bet almost no one of you have met before. It's a professor from Australia who's going to build the ecosystem for the entire shipping industry to be connected. I believe in coincidences and the power of banana leaves. I met this very nice professor at the conference about Maritime Informatics by the Competence Centre Lighthouse here in Gothenburg in May. He fell into my lap for a reason, I think. He is able to explain in a pedagogical way how the shipping industry will benefit from a global ecosystem for maritime informatics. I could never have done it on my own. Richard Watson is a famous professor with internet strategy as his main area. His track record is as long as my arm, and for me not to forget any of his achievements, I will give you a link to it, and just say that he was given the AIS Leo Award in 2011. That is the Association for Information Systems, who recognize truly outstanding individuals in the field of information systems. All recipients of the Leo Award are outstanding scholars or practitioners who have made a global impact on the field of information systems. Today, Richard's biggest research interests are ecological sustainability, energy informatics, and information systems leadership. So he qualifies definitely to be a guest at the Shipping Podcast. I managed to catch him at the conference and book an interview for the day after, before he was leaving for the airport. So I went to Viktoria Swedish ICT and met this lovely man. This happened on May the 19th. I really hope you enjoy this as much as I did. Oh, and when I try to say forest industry, I call that lumber. I'm so sorry and a bit embarrassed. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Who are you?
Well, I'm Rick Watson. As you might gather, I was born in Australia and I've now lived in the United States for 26 years in a row. I had 3 years earlier when I did a PhD at the University of Minnesota, and in between went back to Australia for a couple of years.
I met you yesterday, Richard, in a shipping conference talking about maritime informatics. Tell me a little bit about that. What is maritime informatics?
Well, it's the use of information systems, which is my specialty, to improve the performance of the maritime industry, commercial shipping in general. Specifically, we're focused on efficiency and safety and sustainability, ecological sustainability.
So how come you came up with that idea?
It started really about 5 or 6 years ago. I worked with a colleague, Marie-Claude Boudreau, and we've worked together on a number of projects, and we're both interested in the environment. And we sat down one day and we realised that in our field of information systems, scholars and practitioners weren't interested or weren't paying any attention to the environment and global warming. So we thought this was something that we should be involved in, particularly because information systems have been the major driver for productivity increases for the last half century. So we started off by defining it as green information systems. We got some funding from a group of CIOs to present what we knew about Green IS, what we thought the issues were, and then they gave us some more money to come back and talk. And before the second session, I got up and wrote on the board, energy plus information is less energy, and your job is to put information into the energy equation. And that really resonated with them. Immediately they understood what it was about. We had about half a dozen examples to illustrate how companies were putting information into the energy equation. And so we thought we'll call this Energy Informatics. And we wrote an article for our major journal on it. We wrote a book. We wrote a case study on UPS and how they were applying the ideas, though they didn't call it Energy Informatics. And then I gave a speech at a conference, and Mikael Lind, who's at the Victoria Institute, heard me talk and said, if ever you're in Sweden, come and visit us in Gothenburg. And I said, well, I probably will, because at that stage I was going to Norway every year. And so my wife and I came and visited, and I gave another talk here, and as a result I was invited to become a visiting researcher at Gothenburg, or at Victoria. And we started working together, and then he got into this maritime area, and he said, could we create something called Maritime Informatics? Do you think you could develop that, write an academic paper? And so we started to define it. We haven't written the paper yet. We're gradually putting the pieces together, because it often takes a long time to try and work out what the elements are and how they fit together. As I talked about yesterday, it's like a jigsaw, and the pieces are gradually coming together. And I think we've got the pieces there now, so over the next few months I'll sit down and try and write it. So that's a long story of how I got involved in maritime informatics. And I think the irony of all of this is that I grew up on a farm in Western Australia, about 300 kilometres from the coast, right? We had one radio station, no telephone, no TV, and we got the newspapers twice a week. So I grew up far from the sea, information poor, and I now end up getting involved in maritime informatics. So life takes lots of twists along the way.
Yeah. And how did it all start for you? Where did you start? I understand you are now a professor at the University of Georgia.
Yeah.
How come?
Well, early, my father and mother were not well educated. They left school at 13. My father worked on a farm, so they weren't particularly rich. And I was good at school. And I realised that by getting educated, I would have many opportunities, and I wanted to see the world. So I worked hard at school. When the other kids were messing around, I was the one who worked until 10 o'clock at night. And so I had scholarships to finish high school, and then a scholarship to the University of Western Australia. And then later on I did an MBA degree, and we saved up money to go and study in the United States. So I went there with my wife and 3 young kids. So I knew that education was the way to get ahead. But far more things happened than I ever would have imagined. I never would have thought I would be in Gothenburg many times, let alone one time.
But how did you come into that area? I mean, the IT area.
I was good at mathematics.
And when was this, when you started studying?
I started at the University of Western Australia in 1966. Did mathematics, but it was not very applied. It was not well taught. They had just started to teach computing there. They had a graduate diploma in computation. My scholarship gave me another year to do that, and I found that I really liked that. So I did that course and then got employed by what became Telecom Australia and started writing programs and things like that. I always wanted to teach, but I got 6 years' experience in business, because I thought you can't teach in a business school unless you have some business experience. So I worked in a number of different companies, and then went back to Perth and started teaching information systems. And then
what kind of businesses did you try?
I started off in Telecom Australia, which was the major telecom provider. Spent 2 years there, then worked for a plastics company, probably the largest plastics company in Australia at that stage, because I wanted some private enterprise experience. And then I worked for a 2-person consulting company, and we did transport planning for Melbourne. So I had a range of different experiences. And then I thought, now is the time to go and start teaching. And in between, I'd completed my MBA, so I had a science degree. Now I had a business degree.
So the Melbourne thing there, there was a little bit of transport and logistics, or what did you say?
We did transport planning for Melbourne. So Melbourne has quite an extensive tram system, and they were looking at building freeways. And so we would work out from traffic patterns where they might put various alternatives, where would be a good place to put a freeway that would serve a lot of people. And you could do all of that. The runs would take 4 hours on a computer.
Oh, I see. So maybe I should introduce you to someone else here in Gothenburg, like the tram people.
Yeah. Well, that was a while since I've done that. It was just one of those things that came up. that I thought was a good opportunity for a few years. And the company grew to 5 people during the couple of years I was there.
So, but then when you went to the US?
Yeah, so I wanted to get a PhD, and at that stage the best program in information systems was at the University of Minnesota. They had founded the area, may have had the first PhD program or the second one, but everybody recognised they were the best program, and they have had, at that stage, the person who was considered to be the founder of management information systems had written the first textbook. And so that was the place to go to. And many of the leaders from the field emerged from that program over the first 10 to 15 years. I had no idea what I was going into. Minnesota's extremely cold in winter. I'd never lived in a climate that got below freezing. And my wife comes from Queensland, which is subtropical. We got there and we discovered it was pretty cold winter.
Oh, I see, yeah. Like in Sweden or Norway then?
Yeah, probably worse actually, because we had a month below freezing.
Yeah, we get that.
You get that?
You haven't been north. You haven't visited the Ice Hotel?
No, but I've been as far north as Tromsø in Norway. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we're talking to one of the experts in this IT field. I feel like if anyone can do this for the shipping industry, you are going to do it. That is how I felt when I read your CV and when I listened to you yesterday. How did you come in contact with shipping? Was it just here in Victoria?
It was here at Victoria, and we started working on this problem probably about 2 years ago, and I started to learn about the industry. And when you don't know much about a topic, you have to approach it differently. So I started to look at how is it similar to other things that occur? Because the fundamentals of most things are the same. I have some models of the world that I can apply to just about any situation. And so the shipping industry I could see is a classic example of all businesses. All businesses are trying to create capital. Now, we typically think of economic capital, and so they do some capital conversion process. They get some investment. They create ships, which is a form of capital. They employ people and train people, which is human capital, and they create organisational capital procedures and so forth. And they put all of that together and they carry cargo, and then they get some fees for that. They get economic capital and they plough that back again. All businesses do something like that. So I work in a university. We take human capital. We have conversion processes, which we call education, and we turn out higher quality human capital. Right? So all businesses are essentially the same. And then there are different ways you can structure a business. So you might remember I put up a diagram and showed there's the hierarchy, which you can think of a shipping company as a hierarchy. And then you have markets where capital gets exchanged. And then there's ecosystems where groups of hierarchies or firms cooperate and compete together to create wealth or create capital. And so you can see the shipping industry as one of these ecosystems or a complex adaptive system. And so that I then start to fit that into my framework. And though it's shipping, that's one context. There's a larger picture that helps you to understand it. Now, I don't know all the precise details of shipping, and so I rely on people like you to tell me that. But from an analytical perspective, I can start to understand it and where the issues might be. So, someone who's deep into the shipping industry will quickly realise that I have a superficial understanding of the detail, but I might look at it differently from them, and that's often useful for both of us, right?
That's why I'm talking to you. Yeah. I saw that yesterday, and I thought, I would like to introduce you to some of the sharpest brains that I know, and you would probably
would have fun. We would enjoy it.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, you had that slide yesterday. I hope I can use your slide.
Yeah, I'll give you a copy of my slides. And I have them here. Which one
Well, I was thinking about that ecosystem thing that you were talking about.
The complex adaptive systems.
Yeah.
So this is the one, the notion of capital creation systems and the 4 fundamental ones that we have. And I don't have a slide of a complex adaptive system at this point.
You spoke about one yesterday.
Did I? Oh, the business model.
Yeah. Not the business model. We're going to talk about that as well. But
this one?
We're going to talk about that one.
So this is understanding that there are 4 basic methods of creating capital, and you can think of them as creating wealth, right? And humans have been doing this for thousands of years. It starts with the agricultural society. And this is why we live so well today, because our forebears created capital, created roads and harbours and all the sorts of things that we inherited. And then we build more capital on top of those. So this is another way of thinking about capitalism, but it's a much broader way because it recognises it's not only economic capital, but there's human capital and social capital and symbolic capital and things like that. So there are 4 methods involved in this system, and the hierarchy is a firm. So you bring together a group of people and there's a structure with someone at the top, and it's command and control. And the major problem they have to solve from an information systems perspective is how do you integrate data so that the marketing data and the production data and the human relations data can all be seen at the same time, because often the questions that you have span the organisation. And then how do you integrate the processes between the various parts? And this is something that information systems people have been working on for a while, and SAP have solved it in terms of the enterprise resource planning systems. So we have a good solution of how to run a hierarchy. It takes a lot of effort to install it, and companies like Apple are extremely good at running these things and have very large ERPs. It's not surprising Tim Cook comes from that background. He's a logistics person. And then on the other side, the traditional split then is to think about hierarchies of markets. So markets where people come together and trade things. So it could be trading stocks, for example, trading commodities and so forth. You need some good way of being able to set markets prices fairly. And the information problem for a market is trying to avoid information asymmetry, where one party has more information than the other. Therefore, it's not a good deal. And if you look at stock exchanges, they have all sorts of rules against insider trading to ensure that it's a fair system. They don't always work. But that's the information problem. You want lots of buyers and sellers to have equal information so you can arrive at a fair price for everybody. The other sort of wealth creation mechanism that's emerged in the last couple of years is open source software. And here communities of people come together and develop things, and then they share them. And the information problem there is who can create the new software and who tests it and all those sorts of things. And they've become an important form of wealth creation. And there are quite a few companies in Silicon Valley now that are based upon that method. And then finally, the most complicated one is this ecosystem, where you have many firms and you have markets and you might have open source software all coming together to create wealth. And they're all dependent upon each other. So that the ship needs the tug and the tug needs the ship and all of those. And so they have to harmonise their efforts. There's typically in one of these what's called a keystone, which is the central piece or entity that everybody else is dependent upon, which is the ship in the shipping industry. Without that, the ship, everything else falls apart. Right? You can say the other parts are important as well, but they're minor compared to the ship. And this idea of an ecosystem comes from biology. And there they call it a complex, because there are many moving parts, adaptive, because it's continually changing, and it's a system, because the sum or the total effect is more than just adding up the little bits and pieces, because they cooperate together. The shipping industry, thus for me, is this complex adaptive system, and very little work has been done on understanding how information systems can support it. So that's why, for me, it's a really interesting problem.
I live in Gothenburg, and I mean, that's the city of cars in a way, because we've got a Volvo car and we've got the lorries, the Volvo AB here. So there is a lot of connectivity and digital things being set up in this city. But cars, I mean, you buy a car from a factory and you can choose if you want it red or black or blue, and you get almost the same. You can add on some equipment. But when you build a ship, you decide how that ship should be. You can't sort of, you can probably, but usually you go to a shipyard and you tell them, build this for me. And that is why they go to the countries where it's cheap labor,
Yes.
steel, and I mean, that's the main thing. Put together my ship, which means that there is no conformity. There is no, you can't see, it's not a standard sort of things installed on the bridge or in the ship as a whole. And that is, I think, the biggest problem in a way, because everyone chooses their own. You might have the solution to this, but everyone chooses their own best way of equipping their ship.
Yeah, and it's costly because it's customization. Well, you know, usually when you have those situations, people try and standardize designs or even standardize modules of the design is a way to get there.
Because there is a research going on also at the Chalmers University on the human resource, on how to standardize a bridge and an engine room and so on.
Yeah.
And it has never been done before, standardization in that way. So could that help on the way to what you're trying to solve with?
Standardization would certainly help. It reduces costs for construction. It also, these days, reduces costs for learning. So one of the great breakthroughs in the information systems era was the browser, the common interface. And so you now use that for all programs. But previously, each program had its own interface. And so it was costly to learn how to use them. And it still is to some extent, because if you think about Word and Excel, they have different interfaces. But if you use Google Docs, those are pretty similar because they're all browser-based. So standardization helps in that way, but you can understand why people differentiate, because in an industry you're trying to create a competitive advantage, and if you can create a ship that runs a little bit faster or operates with fewer crew and so forth, you can produce more profit than somebody else. So there's a real incentive there for them to do that. And so the car is different. The car is something that we use for everyday use, and it's not about making profit for us. But if you look at someone like UPS, they probably have customised trucks because they're really important for their central mission. And so it's understandable that the shipping industry would do that.
But they have a lot of trucks then. I mean,
yeah, that's where they get the advantage. They have 90,000 trucks, so they can have some standard models, and the shipping industry doesn't have that.
Yeah, we have got some few giants, and we got some few giants cooperating now and so on. But I mean, a ship owner, there's so many ship owners who are owning maybe 10 ships.
Yeah.
And they have sort of tried to, it's like a family company. They are working hard, and then they get the opportunity to buy a new ship, or they realize they need to get a new ship, and then they work on until the next one. So they're not ordering 10 at the same time.
Yeah, and they're not ordering the same type of ship each time, so that the crew has to learn a different one. They have to learn the features of each ship. Yeah, but there could be parts that they standardise. They could standardise the equipment that's used on the bridge, or the engines that they use, or at least the reporting mechanisms that they get from those. One of the problems with being a manager is the more diversity that you have, the more difficult it is to make good decisions. And the analogy that I use is from medicine. There was this point when surgeons were not specialised. They operated from head to toe. And the Mayo Clinic in the United States changed this. They specialised. And as soon as the surgeons specialised, I just do knees or I just do noses, the success rate went way up. Because if the surgeon's operating on a nose every day, they get really good at it compared to a nose once a month or something like that. And the same thing happens in business. If you're making the same sorts of decisions every day, you get very good at it because you see all of the variety. But if you're operating across a whole range of different things, you never experience enough depth in one problem to get really good at it. And so having a diversity in the sorts of ships they have, or the way they lay out the engine room and the bridge and so forth, limits what they can learn. Right? And then the other thing maybe is as this becomes more an information business, standardising on the ships, but being very good at using information might be the way to compete rather than the old way to compete. Because for many industries now, information is the basis of competition rather than the product that you have. And if you might remember yesterday, the person from Ericsson talked about the transformation of the company from one of installing things to being a company that services and is information-based, right? And turns their products into ways of creating wealth for their customers. Shipping industry might go through that transformation at some stage as well.
I think it takes a generation more.
A generation or intense competition.
Yeah.
Right? That someone in the industry finds a new way to do it, and that suddenly everybody sees that that's quite profitable, and then they'll imitate them pretty quickly or go out of business. Right?
Yeah, that is what's usually happening. Yeah, I'm so much looking forward to this because I think we have already started that paradigm going into the next sort of step of how the business is done. We've seen this digitalization on movies and music and newspapers and so on, and I think we're on the verge, or we're just happening to us, because I can see the big shipping companies, they have realized this, and they are starting to change the way they do business. And also the long period of time now that it has been sort of a financial crisis, or they haven't earned any money for a long while.
Yeah, because when there's an economic dip, they suffer until we get out of that, and we're still in the midst of that. In Europe's still recovering.
Yeah, and still world trade is growing, so it's going to happen. It's going to be, the shipping industry is still going to be there.
Oh yeah, it's really critical because it's a very efficient industry for moving things around the world, but also highly competitive in times when the economy is down, so profits decline. Yeah.
Should we maybe talk about your business model? Because I thought that was also...
Yeah, okay.
I recognize your business model because I've seen it before. I'm not quite sure everyone has, so maybe you should start by talking about that.
All right, so this is based upon a book that came out about 5-6 years ago called Business Model Generation by Alex Osterwelder and Yves Peigneur. And Yves is a long-time friend of mine. And he sent me an early copy of the book, and I read it, and I thought, this is a real winner. And subsequently it was picked up by Wiley, and they've sold 1 million copies of it, and it's now the dominant form of business planning. And I use it when I go into a business to try and understand it. And it consists of 9 cells, and it's a nice diagram. You can print it out large size. You can put it up on the wall, and you start off by saying, what's the value proposition? What value does this company create for some customers? And then you work your way around it, and you go and work out what are the key activities we must do, what are the key resources that we need in order to execute the activities to create the value proposition. What's your model for relating to customers? So it could be retail sales, it could be account specialist who talks to the customer. Then the channels that you move to connect to customers. So again, it could be retail, it could be electronic channels. You look at your customer segments. How do you break up the market? You look at your key partners. Who are you dependent upon to be successful? And then the bottom part looks at what are the key elements of your cost structure and what are the key elements of your revenue. So when I do it, I have sticky notes, and we start off with the value proposition, and we work our way through it. And it's amazing, you get to the end of it, and then people say, we never knew what our business was about. And people don't sit down and do these.
No, and it's so easy.
It's very easy. Yeah. The danger is when people do it, they try and fill things up. You actually only need 2 or 3 things in each cell because you have to describe your priorities. And then you have to tell a story about it. How do the things fit together? So one thing is to create this, and I've always advocated that companies should create it and then put it all around the business, so that everybody in the company knows how it operates, because too often people are misaligned. They think this is the purpose of the business, and they do things that are silly but are logical from their perspective because that's their model of the business. So you get everyone aligned. And then the other thing you can do is you can say, look, in 5 years, what might our value proposition be, or who might be our customers? And so you can start to plot your transition to a different type of business model. Now, what we took with this one was we actually did the business model for the ecosystem. So we put another layer on top to look at I think we added the keystone and the common goal of the industry. And I talked to Eve about whether they'd done that, and they hadn't done it yet for ecosystems. But I think they're planning to do something in that area in the future. But I teach it to my students, and some of them say that's the best part of the course. Every ship owner should have his business model.
I agree.
Yeah.
I definitely agree. Yeah. I can send it to them if they don't.
Yeah, you can send it to them. And, on another visit here, I could go through the thing, or I can find people who could come and run a short course on how to do it.
It's really, really good. And the
simple.
Book is also really
very
helpful.
Accessible. It's very easy to read. It's like a coffee table book for managers, because it lays out the model for Apple and Yahoo and all those sorts of companies. It's very educational.
I agree. Maybe you should talk us through this one, the shipping business model.
So we looked at the ecosystem for commercial shipping and the value proposition as we understand it. And I worked with a case study writer who went out and spoke to a number of people. We have 4 value propositions. The first one is to meet schedule at a competitive price. And importers want to know when things arrive, when will they arrive, and they want to do it at the best price. So they then can plan how those products are going to fit into their supply chain and so forth. The second value proposition is you have to meet legal, contractual and safety obligations, right? And the shipping industry meets those requirements in order to stay in business. The third one is prevent and avoid accidents and environmental damage. That's a social requirement that the ecosystem must meet. And then the real value proposition for society is to provide cheaper goods. So we take advantage of the law of comparative advantage that China currently can manufacture goods at lower price than anybody else, and they manufacture those goods for the world. We also take advantage of things like cotton can be grown in some part of the world and imported to Sweden, right, and manufactured here and so forth. So it's the business model serves the world well. And each shipping company can have a variation on that. So I'm describing it for the entire ecosystem, but each one has their own business model, and they may have different value propositions. They might deliver oil, and they might deliver highly dangerous cargoes in a very safe manner or something like that. Or they might have they might really decide that they deliver on schedule better than anybody else. And so that attracts customers who like the reliability. And probably they need to see the rest to go beyond that. But I think the critical thing for any organisation is to work out what value it creates. And then you build the business around that. Now, I have a friend who is onto his 3rd startup. This one's in Silicon Valley. In fact, he's just created a $1 billion company in about 3 years. And he says to me that the business model is the most critical part of the whole thing. If you don't get that right, everything else fails. He says we can solve all the technology problems, but we have to work out our business model before anything else, and then keep working with that. And if you get that right, everything else will fall into place. So we tend to forget how important the basic goals of the business are and the value proposition is, and then let the other pieces get sorted out.
I agree with you. That's why I'm talking to you. But if you look upon this ecosystem, because yesterday we talked a little bit about, the ship, and then you add on like ports and agents and all of that. How do you see it sort of in a bigger picture? How do they, if you're going to build a digital or connectivity around all of these, where will the exchange of information take place, and who will be the owner of and all of that?
Well, when I first got involved in this project, they had a very hierarchically centralised approach to data and things like that, which I quickly realised wouldn't work, because for any business, data is a competitive advantage. You don't want to give up some things. However, and so data should always stay with the various pieces. The ship owners should always control their data, the terminal owners, everybody. But at some point, they have to work together. And this is what we call episodic tight coupling. The whole industry is about these episodes where they come together and cooperate for a short period of time. So the ship ties up at a berth at the terminal and they work together closely. In order for that to happen, they have to decide which of the data that they have they're going to share, right? And so the ship might share, this is when I'm going to arrive, this is how many containers I have to unload, this is when I would like to leave, right? And then the terminal owners have to say, well, this is my capacity, this is how many containers I can unload per hour, this is what I charge and so forth, and this is when the berth will be available. And by sharing that information, they can then coordinate their activities, right? And that's all they need to share, right? And then once they've finished, they don't share anymore. So we have the notion that each of the groups is streaming data, and you get authorization to tap into that stream to meet the needs of each party. So you might only be able to tap in for 2 or 3 days and only get certain elements, and then that accessibility disappears, right? So they only share the data that's needed to have these successful episodes of tight coupling. And the analogy I used yesterday is like the ATM. You know, when you have this episodic tight coupling with an ATM, and you may never use that ATM again, right? Especially if you're travelling. But there are 2 pieces that you need: a physical card and then a piece of information, the PIN number. And you can take that and you can say in the shipping industry you have the same coupling. There's physical coupling so that containers are standard size and cranes can handle those. But before that, it was difficult to couple, right? The container was a huge innovation in the industry. And then you have the information coupling as well. The terminal operator needs to know which containers and where they are to unload. And so the same sort of thing is happening, right? And so they share data as required. And then they always own it. But the original notion, we should put it all in one big database, which is never going to work. No one's going to give up their data. Right? So you have to be very practical and respect the rights of all of the people in the industry. But I think if you break it down into just episodic tight coupling, you can see how the pieces would work. And therefore you need standards for messaging, right? Just like with the ATM, the standard is the same the world round. I can use my card at any ATM in the world and the same PIN number, right?
I think it's such a good way to describe it.
Yeah, it's the struggle when you teach is always to get simple examples that illustrate the bigger principle, and then people remember it like that, right? Mm. So one of the other things that I use these days when I talk about all assets go online is everything you have needs to be part of a digital data stream describing its current state and things like that. And the great one I've discovered was parking spaces in San Francisco. They're all online, and therefore you can charge when someone's there. As soon as the car leaves, you know that. If they overstay, you know that. So you send the parking inspector only to the cars that have overstayed, not to every car to look at it. And then you manage the revenue according to the demand for each parking space. So in some cases, they've tripled the value of the parking space. But it all starts by putting the parking space online and realising that's an asset that you have to manage. And I'm sure in the shipping industry there are a lot of assets that are not online and not streaming data about their state.
Yeah, I think most of them are not, in a way. And I also think when I meet people who are not in the shipping industry, I usually say, I work in that business where we still use a pen and a paper.
Yeah.
And that needs to be changed if we want to go on this digital new world.
Yeah, and I thought the log yesterday, the shipping log, was a great example of how you can digitise it. You then save work because you're putting in latitude and longitude and time of all those sorts of things, and you're putting them in accurately because you pull them off a sensor network. And then all of these other sorts of digital data streams that are out there can be fed into the log, and you then have a very accurate record of the voyage. And in fact, that will increasingly change as more things get connected and become online. So I thought that was a good place to start.
I agree. And I think when we speak about digital and online and so on, they think I am way out. I am sort of on another planet than the rest of the world, in a way, for them, when I speak to ship owners and the shipping community. Because they think when I speak about digital, no, we don't get our crew online for Facebook, is the answer to that.
Ah, okay.
So that is sort of the perception they haven't really reached the state where you can understand how you can use all this information that you have on a ship if you get online. How do we get there?
Yeah, I think, you're on the right planet.
Thank you. I know. They don't know.
I think they need to go to some conferences like the one that I went to earlier this year, the Intelligent Transport Systems Conference, which was in Detroit. And the car industry was talking about what it's doing. And the car these days is a computer on wheels. Ford released the Fusion, which is a medium-price car. I think it has 70 computers on board, generates gigabytes of data, which Ford can then analyse to understand how the car is operating, and the person can use that data as well, can change their driving behaviour and all of that. So the whole industry is becoming digitised. And the other good example I use when teaching is a McKinsey & Co study of the European banking system, saying that they're only spending about 0.5% of their revenue on digitisation. Those who are late to do it will potentially lose 30% of their revenue, which probably means they go out of business. And so those who are late to digitise are early to exit an industry. It's going to happen. It is a competitive advantage for some of the shipping owners. There was a study at MIT a couple of years ago that showed that companies that are data-driven are more profitable and therefore are more likely to survive in the long run. And this is why data scientists are one of the high-demand jobs in the US these days, and probably in Europe as well, because companies have realised they can create a lot of data, and they can then analyse that, and they can make better decisions. In the long run, shipping owners are the same as any other business owner. They make decisions, and you need data to make better decisions. And so it's always been a competition between decision makers. Now the best armed decision makers are those who have data and the tools for analysing it and the people to interpret it.
Oh, I agree with you. I just want to play the devil's advocate here. And I'm trying to tell you what I hear when I try to talk about digitalization and so on. The next thing is that they say, we can't afford it.
Well, it's very expensive to go out of business.
I agree.
But I think the thing to do is to start experimenting, run some small experiments, get familiar with what technology can do for your business, and be always problem-oriented. The problem with people in the field is they think of technology and they often come and say, you need this sort of technology, you need a database, or you need artificial intelligence. And that's not what it's about. What the technology people should be going and saying, what are the problems that you have, and then work on solutions to those, and not even talk about the technology. And I think one of the big mistakes we make is we talk about information technology, whereas I talk about information systems, which are the people, procedures, and the technology that you put together to solve a problem. Because everybody buys the same technology. It's a commodity. It's the system that you build around that, the people and the procedures and the software, that can make a difference. If you look at someone like Walmart, their strategy is everyday low prices. They built a world-class logistics system that lowers their prices. Kmart and Sears and anybody else in that industry could buy exactly the same technology. IBM were falling over themselves to sell it to them, but Walmart turned it into a system. And the shipping industry needs to think of that. What's the problem? What's the system that can solve it? And then, by the way, put the technology behind the system. And that might be why some of them are reluctant. They get confused by people talking about databases and TCP/IP and every other acronym you want to invent to sound as though they know what they're talking about. In fact, they don't, if they don't address it as, there's a problem that I can help you to solve.
And also I keep saying that, you say now that it's not cheap to invest, it's expensive to invest in this new technology. On the other hand, it's another way of working. You are going to transform your company into another way. You don't add this onto what you already do. You are going to sort of make your business in another way.
Yeah, it's part of becoming a service business, which is a transition many companies have gone through. So originally cars were a product business, and Henry Ford said you can have any colour you want as long as it's black. But GM realised that people wanted more than a black car and started to produce coloured ones and add other sorts of things. So the car industry is a service business these days, and you compete upon the basis of stereo system you provide, the anti-lock brakes and all of those, which are all driven by computers. And information is a service. So, for example, I was speaking at a meeting a couple of weeks ago, and I just mentioned I was working on the Maritime project. And a person in the group came up and said, how do I find out where our cargo is at sea? We know the ship, but we've got no idea where it is. And I said, well, you can use Ship Finder, that's public information. And he said, will that tell me when the ship will arrive? And I said, not necessarily, because they don't always publish the expected time of arrival. And then you don't know how long it's going to queue or the anchorage outside. But he said, for me, and he's in the electrical goods business, knowing when the ship arrives helps me plan. Information is the service. You deliver the product, but you have to deliver all the information that enables the coordination and use of that product as well. I think the shipping companies that can master that will get a competitive advantage.
Yeah, there has been research going on something called the intelligent goods here in Sweden.
Yeah.
And I think they have started by...
lumber.
Yeah. To see where that takes.
Where it originates from, yeah.
And where does it go, and where is it now in the chain of going into that mill? So it is happening, but on the logistical side, it's happening more than it's in the shipping industry. So we are soon we're going to clash more or less.
Yeah, possibly.
Because there are demands from that side, which at the moment we cannot really live up to.
Yeah.
Some of the shipping companies can.
And that might be the pressure. If you go back to Walmart again, they made demands on all of their suppliers. If you want to deal with Walmart, you need to have this information system in place. If not, forget about business with us. And when you're large like Walmart, everybody jumps to their command. But they also, on the other side, they provide information to their suppliers to tell them what's selling and where it's selling and so forth. So they can be smarter. And if you're smarter, you drive down costs. So it's part of the partnership that's the partners require these days, is that sort of information.
So how do you see this going forward, the Maritime Informatics? When are you supposed to deliver the paper?
Well, so I think the next stage, and I meet with Mikael after this, is we're going to talk about a national agenda, what are the research questions, and then hopefully over the next few months I'll put the paper together. But it'll take a while to write it. Writing's a slow job, and I've got other distractions. And then we'll put it in and try to get it published. It takes a while to get a paper published, but we can give some talks about it. But meanwhile, the research continues on because it's part of Mona Lisa. So the paper's only sort of the academic part. The practical part continues. And Mona Lisa is continually producing working papers. We have a meeting in Valencia in June to talk about progress. There's a port CDM system being developed, a prototype of sea traffic management. All of those things are happening. But the grander sort of plan of where we could go in the future is something that I'm working on with Mikael.
It's going to be interesting. And I understand that there will be a conference in November here in Gothenburg on Mona Lisa, sort of final conference on the Mona Lisa 1, I think.
Okay, I didn't know that.
So the Motorways of the Sea, the TNT people is coming here to listen to that.
Yeah.
So it's going to be interesting.
Yeah.
And yesterday when we heard about that Mona Lisa 1 and Mona Lisa 2 are two different things. Yes, I have realized that before. And I'm not quite sure that very many people have seen that there has been a transformation. It's so much more now, and there's so much more good things into that project.
And I think there's an idea of a Mona Lisa 3 at some stage.
It's not going to be called Mona Lisa. Okay. I think it's going to be called Sea Traffic Management.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not into some of the detail of that because I live in the US, so I only see a portion of it. I don't go to all of the meetings. I just can't get to those.
So what does it mean to be a visiting professor here at Viktoria Swedish ICT?
Well, I think it's great.
What does it mean? I mean, what is it? What does it involve?
So I come here twice a year at least. We talk on Skype, sometimes multiple times in a week. We exchange papers, so conference papers they're working on. I get involved in those. I help find some resources. So we had a need for a case study writer. I have a person that I work with who's Canadian, and I linked her in. We needed to write a review of what we already knew, a literature review. I had a master's student, or actually she's now a doctoral student at Georgia Tech. I got her involved. So I help find resources, and I'm a sounding board for some of the ideas that they put forward. So I will go through and say, well, let's talk about this one, or here's a different way of thinking about it. And then we have good brainstorming sessions here. Mikael and I work together well. We bounce ideas off each other and come away with a lot more work. And the good thing for me is, as I think I mentioned to you yesterday, I had a pen pal here when I was about 15 or something like that in Australia. And this was a place I never imagined I would visit. The other thing about Sweden, my next door neighbour was into fishing, and there was a Swedish company that made fishing rods and reels, and their catalogues were beautiful. And so you'd see all these photos of Sweden. I thought, this must be a wonderful place to visit. And of course it is. So I enjoy very much coming here, and my wife comes with me frequently. She enjoys the city as well.
What does your wife do?
Oh, my wife retired some years ago. Actually, we met. She was a computer programmer as well, and worked in that industry for more than a decade. And then when we moved to the US, she couldn't work because I didn't have a green card. I was on a H1 visa. So she stopped doing that, and then she worked in some other things. But I had many opportunities to travel, so we decided that there was not much sense in her working. She might as well come along with me. So we might visit maybe as many as a dozen countries in a year.
Oh my God.
Yeah, well, I get lots of invitations to go and
I can
talk.
understand.
Yeah,
that.
I have a good job.
I feel privileged. Thank you very much for taking the time. I look forward to seeing what your work will bring the shipping industry forward.
Yeah, I think what you're doing is a great idea. And please send me details of your podcasts. I'll listen to them when I'm running or exercising.
Yeah, you can help me by downloading it, and then I will probably sort of be a rocket on the iTunes algorithms, I understand. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Linda.
Wow, wasn't that something? We got the business model explained to us. We now know that the shipping industry needs to be transformed into a service business, and that Tim Cook is a logistics person. Psst, that is the CEO of Apple, in case you wonder. I can tell you how excited I am to learn more from Richard and Michael. Maybe I need to go and make an interview with Mikael Lind as well, to see how far they have advanced. Well, there will be a podcast about the Mona Lisa project further down the line, but meanwhile, if you want to follow Richard on Twitter, his handle is at RTW30606. I must take this opportunity to say that I feel blessed to have the possibility to have conversations like this with interesting people, and there are so many of them out there. Please show me some support by downloading and subscribing to the podcast. Since most of podcast listeners use iOS or Apple products when listening, I'm chasing you into iTunes for downloads and reviews. Don't forget to review. That is part of the algorithm which will take us up to the top 10 list of iTunes. I have had the question about how to go about it if you're using Android mobiles. Well, there is an app for that as well. You can use the Stitcher app. Search for the Shipping Podcast and you're all set to go. But are you telling your friends? Have you told your boss how great the Shipping Podcast is? Have you told anyone outside the shipping industry yet? Remember, I'm doing this to get the entire industry more visible, and you can help me. Until the next time, then we will listen to a supplier to the industry, an outstanding entrepreneur. You will fall in love with him as well, I promise you. Bye-bye.